There's a book by Simon Sinek where he talks about leaders eat last, and we were always taught officers eat last. And the idea is that from a kind of service point of view, you're making sure that all your troops and all the people under your command, if that's the case, are taken care of. And if you're eating last, if the food's run out before it's got to you, then you know that there's a couple of people that kind of haven't eaten. And if the officer, the boss, is eating last, then the cooks will be making sure that there is plenty of food for everyone, because I don't want the boss to kind of miss out at the end. My Air Force experience is probably very foundational to who and what I am today. So, at the age of 20, in my third year, I was a cadet in charge of like 180 people, So we kind of talk about leadership and management experience, talk about kind of being thrown in there at the deep end at, age 20. You could have the best photographs of Australia ever, and you could maybe have the best collection of photographs. But if no one knows about it, no one's going to buy it, So
Scott blends military precision, creative storytelling, and nearly 2 decades of business success. From the Air Force to building a trusted brand, his systems are designed to set you up for success.
To kind of sit back, and we would talk about, in the military, big hands, little map. Look at the big kind of picture. Sit back in that big leather armchair and kind of look at the map and just take time. So I spent a lot of my time in the fighter community, the fighter air crew, where we were very, very big on the whole idea of plan, brief, execute, debrief. Why don't you join the Air Force and they'll pay for your pilot training?
Scott, thank you so much for making the time to have this conversation. I've had the privilege over the last few years to see your work, but also to understand your story from speaking with my connections, meeting your beautiful wife when she's traveling to promote things. I'm very, very interested to wind back a few years and speak about how this person was built. If you go back to the time you spent at the Air Force, how did that shape the person you are today?
Oh, great question to kick things off. I would say, that my Air Force experience is probably very foundational to who and what I am today. So I was very lucky that, straight out of school, I joined the military, went to the Defence Force Academy, and, spent 3 years of officer training there. At the age of 20, in my third year, I was a cadet in charge of like 180 people, So we kind of talk about leadership and management experience, talk about kind of being thrown in there at the deep end at, age 20, and things have kind of built from there. So I think for me, the Air Force experience is very foundational. The experience that I had even prior to that, so I went to school, but I was in their training corps, as a kid, so Air Force cadets. So I had a kind of a military interest and background and exposure, as a teenager even. So even before I joined the Air Force, I'd already been exposed to that. So I think some of that was already kind of being ingrained in me, even at a young age, even before I kind of joined, out of school. So I think, really what the Air Force taught me, we could probably have an entire conversation about, what the Air Force taught me. But I guess it's fair to say that it was very, very foundational. And I think a lot of the skills, the frameworks and the methodologies that I guess the Air Force and the military kind of more broadly kind of taught me have really set me up for life. That I think what a lot of people, and I probably didn't understand at the time, was how applicable that is just to life, to business, and to everything else. And so I think when you're kind of young and you're 18, you're very focused on thinking about how this is applicable to what I've got to do. As in my case, I was an officer. So how do I, from a leadership point of view and people that I'm going to have to lead and manage in my career, how do I and how does all that relate to the conduct of military operations and things like that? But what I probably didn't appreciate at the time, where I do now, is just how important a lot of those skills and that is. So what was all that, and what did that kind of teach me in terms of that foundation? I think, like I said, we could probably have an entire conversation about that. But, I think, everyone kind of thinks about the military and the discipline and some of those things. But what that does in that, especially in that initial training, is really, I guess, get you used to that kind of structure and that environment. And then everyone is operating in the same environment. And so, everyone that you're dealing with in the military is kind of been through the same thing. So there is a kind of common understanding and a common acceptance of what you've kind of all been through. So when you're trying to build a team and you try to build higher performance, you start to realize, I guess, as I look back on that, how important from a cultural perspective, having some of those kind of common experiences, going through common training, have everyone have a degree of trust and acceptance that I know that you when I say something, know exactly what I mean, and that I can trust and know that you're going to kind of carry it out in a particular way. When we get a whole lot of people into organization and we don't go through a degree of, say, decent onboarding, we don't give people a kind of common understanding of values and what it is that we're, purpose, we would call it these days, what it is that we're here to kind of achieve, you start to realize that that's when some of those kind of cultural and organizational aspects start to fall apart. So I think one of those early foundations for me, especially around all that initial training, is just how important it is to essentially form a team and for everyone to kind of go through some of that common training, be really, really, we would talk about, aligned in terms of values these days, just how important that is to then build, high performance teams. And so I think if you're wanting to build, as I look at it these days, high performance teams, you realize how important some of that foundational stuff is. That's kind of one aspect when you go through all that training. But I guess more broadly, what did the military teach me? I think, what the military ultimately is about from an officer training point of view, and what I went through is how do I lead a group of people, often with a range of kind of different or disparate, backgrounds, different training and different, roles or job types that they have. And how do I bring them all together, align them around a purpose and unite them around that, but lay the foundation so that I can set them up for success. So I think, the basis of a lot of that kind of officer training is it's not about you. It's about other people. And, you're trying to make sure that you're doing the right thing for other people, setting them up for success, setting the conditions in place so they can succeed. And, there's a book, I think, by Simon Sinek, where I think he talks about leaders eat last, and we were always taught officers eat last. And the idea is that from a kind of service point of view, you're making sure that, all your troops and all the people under your command, if that's the case, are taken care of. And if you're eating last, if the food's run out before it's got to you, then that there's a couple of people that kind of haven't eaten. And if the officer, the boss, is eating last, then the cooks will be making sure that there is plenty of food for everyone, because I don't want the boss to kind of miss out at the end, And so you can kind of pull that apart in lots of different ways, but it is very much about this mindset from a leadership point of view that you are there to kind of serve those and look after those that are under you, if you want to think of it in that context. And so I think that is a very, very important kind of foundation that is stuck with me. That it is about me making sure that I'm looking after the people that are, I hate the word beneath me, because that, but that's the way I guess the military would kind of talk about it in a rank structure sense. But I guess, looking after the people that are in, that you're responsible for would probably be a better way of thinking about it. So that was definitely the kind of the officer aspect of that. And how do you get the most out of people? Then there's obviously the very military aspects to it, which is around, how do you kind of plan and conduct operations? That is ultimately about, how do we prevail and win over an adversary? And how do I then have an organization and systems and structures that kind of support that as well? So I think, the foundations again there around, the importance of planning, the importance of, preparation and bringing everyone together on that are skills that I think, in my case have been very, very applicable, in careers subsequent, around the importance of planning and how important kind of rehearsal is, when you don't want to just go and do something for the first time, in combat, because it'll all kind of go wrong. You want to have, rehearsed that as much as you can. You want to have trained for that as much as you can. The idea, kind of train hard, fight easy, is very, very true. And I think a lot of organizations just expect everyone to kind of rock up on the day and everything to kind of go smoothly, versus, hey, how much have we actually practiced this? Have we rehearsed this? Have we trained for this? So that then on the day, you've kind of practiced for all these million things that could go wrong. And then on the day, only a few things go wrong. And you're like, oh, that's easy because we've kind of trained for that. So I think, that was definitely something that I probably took away, certainly from some of that earlier kind of military training. And then obviously, got to then apply that for real, in operational service in the Middle East and Iraq and other places, to actually see how all that actually, does it actually work, when you actually kind of got to, do it for real. So I think, I was very, very lucky in terms of what I got exposed to during my Air Force career. It definitely didn't give me that. It definitely gave me that foundation that has been able to be applied elsewhere. And then the next bit is that it is applicable, beyond the military.
What attracted you to the Air Force?
flying a fighter aircraft pretty much. So I think, honestly, I grew up in a family that had a very, very kind of strong aviation kind of heritage, perhaps, if you want to think of it that way. My dad was an air traffic controller. We grew up just near Essendon Airport, and Dad was an air traffic controller at both Essendon Airport and Tullamarine Airport, which was not far away. So kind of grew up near two airports. My auntie was an Ansett hostie. My uncle was an Ansett pilot. My other auntie worked kind of in the travel industry with Ansett for a little bit. So surrounded kind of by aircraft. And then, in my later years, joined the Air Training Corps and things like that. But that was probably after I'd kind of decided that I wanted to be a pilot in the Air Force. So I think really what happened was probably early in year 7, I'd kind of got it in my head that I wanted to be a pilot. And I think I told Dad that I wanted to be a pilot. And I think Dad was probably just scared by the dollar signs of, how much is, my son going to have to pay for pilot training. And I think, we were just, before we were going to go out, somewhere one day, waiting for Mum and my sister to kind of get organised and having this little kind of chat with Dad. And he's like, well, why don't you join the Air Force and they'll pay for your pilot training? And I was like, that sounds like a, fantastic idea. And that was probably driven by Dad, trying to, provide an alternate, kind of financial pathway for me to learn to be a pilot, I think. But I'd never really kind of thought about the Air Force or was aware of the Air Force really at that juncture. And then that probably just started me down that kind of path to kind of explore that. And that's then when I really, started to, investigate that and kind of be quite firm that I wanted to be a pilot. And then secondly, that I wanted to be a pilot in the Air Force. And so that's really what attracted me. Yeah, flying, I think, initially the idea of flying and being a pilot is what attracted me more than the military aspect. And then I think the more I looked into it, I liked the idea of the military bit as well. But it was definitely the idea that I could go and fly.
You spoke about Simon Sinek and the wonderful work he has done. I've heard lots of military examples that he's brought in. I've also spent years in human resources when I started my career, and I've seen some things done not so well. So we've seen this structure and discipline in the military, and back home in Sri Lanka, I don't know how it was here, but we used to have these high-performing leaders go and attend a course called Outward Bound. So you will take them, some military sergeant will teach you how to do a thrust fall, will take you canyoning, and you'll be really charged up for that day and come back to office and do the same things. What is it that about that mindset in the military training, in your time spent working together, in your time spent understanding what service is and leadership, what's the mindset shift look like?
That's a good question. I think there's probably two things. One is purpose, as in that you are very, very clear on what you are there to do at a very, if you're in a small section and you're even the lowest ranking, troop, you're very, very clear on what your job is, what your task is, but equally how that ties to the bigger picture. And I think a lot of people outside the military kind of struggle because they don't understand how the task or the work that they're doing fits to the bigger picture. And so what I mean by that is if you take, a military operation or something like that, in an oversimplified sense, is, this, you might have tasked in an army sense, a section to go and, undertake an operation to essentially, take, or overrun another adversary kind of position. That's very easy. I understand what my job is. I understand what tactics I've got to do. I understand how I've got to work with the team to kind of perform that. But what is really, really important is that individual understands that, okay, once you've taken that position, by taking that position, it's going to allow another maneuver force to come in that will ultimately enable us to take that hill. When we've taken the top of that hill, we'll be able to observe what's going on in a bigger picture, which will allow us to secure the entry of a much bigger force to come in, which is actually going to go and take this town or this area, which is obviously, once we control that, we can control the supply lines to something and it's going to help us win the war kind of thing. And so, it is this idea that you understand that even what may appear as a small kind of insignificant contribution is actually playing a part in a broader effort to ultimately perhaps kind of win the war, and I think everyone is very, very clear on that purpose and that contribution. And obviously, look, you can kind of, you can kind of get frustrated within that too, in the sense that sometimes, you start to realize that maybe, my contribution isn't as big as I thought. And that's, any organization or what have you. But I think I get the sense that in the military, or certainly when I was in, that there was a far bigger sense of what we would these days kind of call purpose around what you were doing and how that fitted into the bigger picture. So there's that aspect, I think, that is kind of fundamental. I guess the other bit is around probably my earlier point around that being part of a team, being part of a collective effort that is all working towards the same thing. You're very, very clear again because you're aligned around this kind of purpose, whether it be, kind of mission focused or the broader kind of campaign objective. Everyone is kind of aligned around that and working towards the same thing. And then you're working with a bunch of people who are all very, very good at what they do, and you've trained hard with them. And so I think there is this just sense of belonging. We talk about mateship and things like that as well. But if I was to kind of narrow it down, I think, really, really having strong alignment around that kind of purpose really, really does help. And, when I talk to kind of organizations outside the military, I think that is certainly one aspect that I think a lot could learn from a leadership point of view. And those leaders that do really, really well, I believe, are very, very good at communicating what that kind of broader purpose is and aligning their organization, their people towards what that is. Now, how you select that and making sure that that's something that's meaningful and relevant to each individual that they're happy to kind of sign up to is important as well, because just because you've got a great purpose doesn't mean that everyone in the organization is going to necessarily agree with that. So I think, that is certainly something that I've probably taken away and that I look back and reflect on. And you talk about, doing an outward bound activity or what have you. I think the challenge with that is you go and do that once, kind of sounds good, it's a bit of fun for the day, but you've got to kind of keep carrying that on. And I think when you do that every single day, those types of activities, and you constantly have that kind of activity, that's when you really kind of form it in a civilian organization sense, if you want to think about that. Going and doing one kind of little team bonding activity one day a year, it's kind of a bit of fun. It kind of gives you a little bit of insight, but that's not enough to generate, kind of organizational cultural change to lead to high performance. You've got to be relentless around the pursuit of perfection, perhaps, if you want to think of it that way. That 1% better every day I kind of talk about. I'm a big subscriber to that. You have to be relentless in just pursuing that the whole time. One little kind of offsite activity isn't enough. You've got to be relentless at kind of pursuing that.
And is that resilience that in a broad sense, the military has, that sometimes in corporate organizations we struggle to have? Because we are, in my perception, we overestimate what we can achieve in a month, but we hugely underestimate what we can achieve over a year, because we're chasing a number, we're chasing a target. But in a broader military or a purpose-driven organization like that, you have people that you care for. You have a purpose that unifies you. And your consequences are not just loss of profit or loss of market share. Sometimes it's loss of life. Are those factors that make you more resilient?
Well, resilience in itself is an interesting conversation that we could probably talk again all day on. Look, I think, you're right in a sense that I think human nature, whether it's in the military or outside, you're right. We overestimate how much we can kind of achieve in a short term, and often do underestimate what we can achieve in a longer term. I think that's a bit of a human characteristic that's not necessarily unique to military/civilian kind of context. But my experience in the military, and again, everyone's different, is that I spent a lot of my time in the fighter community. With fighter aircrew, where we were very, very big on the whole idea of what we would call, plan, brief, execute, debrief. So you would plan an activity, you would brief it, you would go and execute it, and then you would debrief it. So a really extreme example of this is when you're doing basic fighter maneuvering or dogfighting in it. As a lot of people kind of outside will kind of know about it. That mission in a fighter aircraft, because you're burning so much fuel, because you're is often quite short. A BFM mission might be as short as 30 minutes, but you might spend 3 hours debriefing that mission. So you are trying to extract the absolute maximum amount of training value and lessons learned out of every single kind of activity that you do. And some people just kind of find that confronting almost, that you would go and do something for only 30 minutes and yet you would spend multiple hours, pulling it apart and debriefing it. And so that in a military, I've gone and done management consulting kind of since, we would talk about that in a continuous improvement kind of mindset in terms of the way we kind of describe that today. But that's not how we kind of would have described it back then. But that's what it is. It's like, how do I make sure that I kind of extract every bit of value out of it, but that we're constantly improving? And that is that PBED, plan, brief, execute, debrief kind of methodology, if you want, is applied to everything. And so as a result, you are just generating a very, very tight, quick kind of learning environment on absolutely kind of everything you do. And so when you pull apart and debrief absolutely everything that you do, you find the faults quite quickly. You're able to kind of turn that around quite quickly, rather than sitting there and going, we kind of did that, and then 3 months later, that lesson learned is applied. It's applied the very next time you go flying, the very next day, or maybe later that afternoon. So it shortens that kind of cycle of how quickly you're able to apply some of those lessons. It's not necessarily tied to resilience necessarily per se. I think the resilience thing is more related to the fact that you kind of get to experience things in a training environment where if things go wrong, it doesn't matter. Well, so that's not 100% true, because in a flying sense, people can still kind of get killed, and if there's collisions and so forth. But you are doing things the best you can in a training environment where the consequences aren't as great in terms of a mission outcome against an adversary. So you're far more comfortable with the fact that things can go wrong and that you can, learn from them, so that when you've actually got to go and do it for real, you're far better placed to do that. And so the whole, the military takes people essentially off the street, and it's not like 2 days later, they're combat ready. It is a journey. And so you're putting people progressively through more and more kind of uncomfortable situations. So I think, resilience is built over time, where you're taking someone, off civvy street, putting them in a military training environment, and increasingly exposing them to things that make them feel uncomfortable. And then as a result of doing that, they get comfortable. We talk about being comfortable, being uncomfortable. And you realize that, that wasn't that bad. And then the next thing's a little bit worse, and you kind of just keep going. And as a result, I think you build resilience around this notion that, I can handle that because I handled that before. And then, you just, things that seem just slightly out of reach, you keep mentally realizing that, no, I can actually do that. I can achieve that. And so then when you're thrown into a completely unfamiliar, different environment, I think you end up having the internal self-confidence. I can do that. Because I've done all these other things, you're a lot more comfortable with your own abilities to just, okay, I'll work out. I got no idea what I'm meant to do here, but I'm completely comfortable that I can work it out quite quickly. I'll talk to the right people, or I can sit down and appreciate the situation and analyze it, and then come up with a course of action. And that's what comes out of that training. And so the more time you spend in that environment, the more years you do that, I think you do become more resilient, because you've just experienced so much of that. Whereas in a more corporate environment, you just don't go through those activities. You don't go through those experiences. And so I think, there's also less probably room for error as well. And so what I mean by that is, by going through that military training environment, you're expected to make mistakes. Like, there is an expectation. We're giving you a task, in a training situation, we're giving a bunch of trainees a situation we know that they will not be able to complete deliberately, right? And that goes on and on and on. Whereas in a corporate sense, there's this kind of expectation that, someone kind of starts in your organization tomorrow, and then you give them a task the next day. There's kind of an expectation they're going to be able to complete it. And there's this kind of constant expectation on them as well. And so they have this kind of, pressure on themselves that they think that they've got to be able to deliver on that, versus an acceptance, I think, that, hey, we're kind of giving them something that maybe they won't be able to complete. But equally, we don't never push them. We kind of give them something with the complete expectation from ourselves, as a corporate body, that they'll be able to complete it, versus going, you know what, I'm giving a bunch of these people something I know they're not going to be able to complete. And I'm completely comfortable with that, because I'm treating this as a learning opportunity. So we don't, in a corporate sense, I believe we don't invest in our people enough. And I'm kind of generalizing across corporations here, but I believe corporations don't invest enough in their people to train them to take them out of essentially their day-to-day activity and accept the fact that they're not kind of delivering towards our direct kind of corporate KPIs, whatever that may be, that actually I'm spending time making these people better and that they're going to fail in a bunch of things that they're doing, and just that acceptance of failure, because it's about learning. And I don't think we invest, and when I say we as a kind of corporate world don't invest enough in training people to become better.
I'd love to build on the fact that you touched on that. The second day you joined the Air Force, you weren't flying a fighter pilot, an aircraft. There is a journey to get there. What was the hardest part of that journey before you got to set foot in an aircraft? What was the hardest part of the journey, and what does that hardest part teach you about yourself?
Yeah, also, I guess so for me, I joined the Air Force to be a pilot, but I went through officer training at ADFA. So I had 3 years before I even went to pilot's course, and then pilot's course is about 18 months. Now I didn't make it through pilot's course, so I didn't pass. So a lot of people don't, and I was in that kind of cohort of people that didn't kind of make it through. So I for 3 years, before I even got to pilot's course. So I wanted to join as a pilot. I wanted to be a pilot and fly fighter aircraft. I had to kind of do 3 years of, that officer training first and do my degree and tertiary, education at the same time before I even got the opportunity or the chance to, okay, now I'm kind of here for what I'm here for in a sense. But, again, when I talked early on about your kind of question was around, the foundation of things, I had 3 years of kind of training before I even actually got to what I'd kind of joined to do, which was to be a pilot. That was a 3-year kind of journey just up to that point before my actual pilot training started. So, you cannot get through all of that unless you're very, very, again, very kind of focused on what's the purpose? Why am I here? Why am I kind of putting up with this? Why am I marching on a parade ground at -6 degrees here in Canberra on a frosty parade ground at ADFA? Like, why am I doing this? Like, I'm 19 years old. Like, unless all my mates that I went through school with are probably still in bed because they've, been at the pub the night before or whatever the case may be. But, here I am early in the morning out marching on a parade ground. You have to be kind of internally pretty kind of strongly motivated, I guess, as to why you're kind of putting yourself through that, based off where you're trying to get to. Because if you're not sufficiently motivated enough towards that, you're just like, why am I here? Like, why am I kind of doing this? I don't need to put up with this. I don't need some, drill sergeant or warrant officer kind of barking at me, kind of telling me off. And while I'm here, freezing my bum off at, kind of -6 in the morning, like it's, so there is the kind of people, I guess, that, are getting through that have probably got to have a reasonable degree of kind of, self-motivation, kind of purpose around why they want to do that. Because if you don't, you won't succeed. And I think that already some of the kind of mindset or the types of personalities or people that are kind of either being attracted or are in that kind of training pipeline are probably already, I don't want to use the word above average in that sense, but you're a little bit different to maybe the norm around your degree of kind of self-motivation in that respect, because you're willing to put up with a bunch of that because you're very focused on what you want to try to achieve.
And thank you for sharing that perspective. The reason I asked the question is I have the privilege to talk to some young management trainees, and sometimes they surprise me with things like, oh, I want to leave. And when I probe into, oh, why, you've joined, it's been 3 months, been a good journey. Yeah, but I'm not making a difference. This is not where I see myself. And I'm like, you're 20. Let's build to it. Let's work towards it. Let's get some mentorship. And I think the generation now needs a little bit more guidance of everyone who's achieved something, they didn't achieve it overnight. Building on that, Scott, a lot of children, a lot of young adults watching, what Hollywood's producing now, but even in the past, watching Top Gun and saying, hey, I can do these 3 things. All I need to be is athletic, charming, and suddenly I'm flying an aircraft. Is that perception needing a little bit of temperament in there? Do we need to understand that instant gratification is not always possible?
100%, and would totally agree. And I think what, a lot of the narratives miss, whether it be, from a Hollywood perspective or, what some social kind of media influencer is trying to tell you or showing you, is the level of kind of patience, the level of grit and determination that has gone on. And I think we're living in a very, if you talk about social media in the current environment, I think people just forget how curated that is. And what you are seeing is very, very selective about what an influencer or a particular person has chosen, or a brand has chosen to present you. I know it myself. It's not like I have a big social media presence or anything like that, but I'm out photographing sunrise and sunset, spending a lot of time outdoors. A lot of the time I'm just simply focused on trying to do my job in terms of take landscape photos and things like that. And people are like, oh, I want to see more of you behind the scenes. I forget that I should maybe take a selfie or do some of that kind of stuff. But then again, when you do, so in that sense, it's not even necessarily deliberately curated. It's not like I'm just got the camera on me the whole time. So when I do remember to do it, that's just a tiny snapshot. But when you get to some of these big kind of, global influencers, they've got an entire team of people, around them. They're making sure the makeup's perfect, the lighting's perfect, all this kind of stuff. You think that they're just taking a little selfie. It's actually not even probably a selfie on their phone. It's taken by a professional photographer that set up all the lighting and all that kind of stuff beforehand. And so firstly, I think you've got to kind of remember just how curated that is, how kind of not fake, but, how much of a small, tiny representation and potentially professionally produced some of that is. So it's not necessarily a true reflection of that. Equally, it might have been a 2 or 3 hour setup for that person to get that kind of one shot. And so again, it's not like that's their entire day. There's a lot of background that's gone to that. And, you actually hear from some of these, influencers, they are like a lot of them are working their bum off. Like, there is a lot of work going on behind the scenes. People just think that they're living this kind of flashy lifestyle because that's what they're presenting, but people forget all the stuff that's kind of goes on behind the scenes. So I think, I do believe there is no such thing as overnight success in that case. Everyone who is an overnight success, you then go and, hear interviews with them and they talk about, the 10-year or longer kind of journey that took them to get there and just how hard it was, but also just how many setbacks they have. So I think, for me, and this is certainly something, again, coming back to the kind of military background, is just the level of grit and determination that is required to kind of continue to proceed despite the number of setbacks and objectives that are kind of, put before you. It is that determination to just keep going despite what keeps getting thrown at you. And I think the risk is that, I think in the current environment, is that people don't realize how much of that is required, and they just want the instant gratification because they see, oh, such and such is doing the same thing as me and they've got, X, number of followers and they look like they've got a really, really successful business. Well, firstly, it may not be a successful business. They're just presenting a facade of what it is to feed either their own ego or to they believe that that's kind of what's required. And what ends up happening is everyone ends up trying to kind of copy or emulate that without sitting back. Now this is the management kind of consultant in me coming out around saying, well, what is the strategy around what I'm trying to do as a business here? Why is it that I think I need to do this? And why do I need to present my brand or myself in a particular way? So firstly, they're kind of missing some of that aspect, but then they realize that it's, some of this is a long game and that it is about showing up every single day and, being persistent. So I think persistence and grit is the key. Again, we talk about Simon Sinek. I think, I saw something from him a while back, talking about, if you go to the, how do you kind of get fit and bulk up or what have you? You can't go to the gym once, lift a bunch of weights and then expect you're going to look in the mirror and suddenly you're going to look like Arnie Schwarzenegger. But equally, if you go to the gym every single day and then you miss a day, that's not the end of the world either because it's only one day. What matters is persistence and the routine. And so I think people have got to really, and that's again, probably something that I learned from the military about routine, about kind of doing the same thing, kind of day in, day out. And it's the result of consistent application every single day, showing up every single day, and over a period of time, that's what will result. You can't just wake up on January the 1st and go, I want to look like Arnie Schwarzenegger this year, go to the gym for a month and expect that's going to happen. You've got to do that for probably a number of years and be really, really, disciplined around what you eat, how you exercise, getting a trainer, all that kind of stuff. You can't just expect you're going to look like Arnie Schwarzenegger, by January 31st as a New Year's resolution. But that's kind of the expectation, I think, that we are creating for a lot of people around, from an instant gratification point of view. Whereas I believe, a marker of genuine kind of success, or sorry, what I mean by that is like genuine long-term success, i.e. building something that is sustainable, is around that just showing up every single day. I'm a big believer in that 1% better every day. And that, the cumulative effect of what you're doing is what matters. Simon Sinek talks about, brushing your teeth. If you miss brushing your teeth this morning, it's okay. But if you've brushed your teeth for a lifetime, you're probably not going to get too many cavities. But if you just don't brush your teeth consistently, so again, it's the reverse. If you just consistently don't do it, then you're not going to have great oral hygiene either.
And I think that framing's really important in terms of the consistency. So you've spoken about consistency, you've spoken about discipline, you've spoken about camaraderie, you've spoken about practicing before, let's call it the theater of war. In your experience, when you're in that battle, when you're in, let's say, for example, in the Middle East, and you see things not going well, not going according to plan, what does that teach you about leadership?
Yeah, good question. So look, I think, I would be lucky to say that, I've experienced good and bad leadership in my time, and including, during my time in the Middle East, there were some incredible successes, but also some interesting failures. I think, when I look at the failures, and one that I often kind of talk about that I kind of got some exposure to prior was, there's an activity taken, as a bunch of US forces were kind of getting closer to Baghdad. But Saddam Hussein had moved some of his Republican Guard divisions kind of to the south of Baghdad. And one night, the US Army decided to undertake an operation that had over, probably just over 30 Apache, helicopters. And, before that operation happened, a bunch of us thought this is just doomed. We knew that it was kind of doomed to failure, but there was definitely a kind of push from the more kind of senior leadership to kind of, no, it's going to kind of happen. Guess what? Didn't go so well. Nearly all of those helicopters were kind of shot up. One of them was shot down. The 2 aircrew got captured and were prisoners of war and paraded on Iraqi TV. Nearly all the helicopters were, then because they were so damaged, were unavailable for subsequent operations. It then, really kind of shifted then what the offensive kind of firepower that was available to deal with, some of these Republican Guard divisions, which then ultimately fell on a lot of the US Air Force to kind of deal with and things like that. But what the lesson out of that was, for me, that was foreseeable before it kind of happened. And I think, that was also a little bit of, differences between the services. The US Air Force and the Air Forces, Allied Air Forces more broadly, had learnt a lot of lessons, all the way from kind of, Korea, Vietnam, and then even in the first Gulf War around, not doing things at low level, moving things to higher altitudes to deal with a range of those different kind of surface to air threats, whether it be anti-aircraft artillery, some of those shorter range surface to air missiles and things like that. Just no longer doing that kind of activity at low level because it was just too high risk and you're pretty much kind of guaranteed to get shot. And yet, despite all of those lessons, despite a whole lot of kind of shift in, tactics, techniques and procedures around you operating in that kind of environment, this activity, kind of went ahead and no surprises in terms of the results. And so for me, that was, from a leadership point of view, your first responsibility is kind of taking care of your troops. It just kind of flew in the face of that. But more broadly, it was reflective, I think, of, amongst some of those decision makers that pressed ahead with that, they hadn't kind of, adapted. They hadn't kind of been taking on a bunch of those lessons learned. There hadn't been enough of that learning that I was kind of talking about earlier, that was then shaping and shifting how they kind of conducted operations. And perhaps you could argue, a degree of arrogance around, well, no, we kind of know best, this will kind of work, despite perhaps, a bigger kind of broader knowledge that maybe that's not really the way we need to kind of shift. So I think, the lesson for me out of that from a leadership point of view is, the world moves on, the world shifts, what worked yesterday may not work today. And you have to kind of be very, very careful about making sure that just because something that you did or applied has worked previously in the past doesn't mean that it's going to work now. And we always kind of say in the military, like, the enemy gets a say, right? So, we might have come up with the best plan, but the adversary's got their own plan as well, right? And, you don't know what they do or don't know about how you're going to operate or what have you. And so you can't kind of just operate in isolation thinking that, well, we kind of know best and we're just going to go and do this. The adversary has an input into that of which you don't necessarily have full control over. And so, it really, some of those kind of failures, I guess, in the Middle East that I kind of got to see was, around that inability of some leaders to evolve or accept that what had kind of worked in the past may not work now, but also just sometimes you just can't be so kind of belligerent that I'm just going to kind of press on no matter what. So I kind of earlier was talking about kind of grit and perseverance and the need to just kind of press on despite objectives, but you still need the ability to kind of sit back objectively and say, is this actually still the right strategy or the right tactic to kind of do that? So, you need kind of grit and perseverance to kind of just keep pushing up against a bunch of those challenges, but you also need the ability to kind of objectively sit back and say, am I actually trying to push up against this the right way? Do I need to go around this, in a slightly different way? So you need that grit and determination and that perseverance to kind of keep pushing, but you also need the ability to sit back and say, am I actually pushing in the right way? Like, do I need to approach this in a different way? So yes, I need to kind of keep pushing, but, is that still valid? Is it still a valid approach? Do I need to try a different way? And you owe it to those people, especially, in those cases, when people are getting shot, a lot of dollars worth of military equipment, of taxpayer dollars kind of being destroyed, just on something that, for a lot of people was quite foreseeable. But equally, I think that is a lesson in itself too sometimes, is that, when you're really, really close to a problem, sometimes it isn't foreseeable to you because, you haven't had that chance to kind of step back. You're very, very close to the problem. Maybe you're not taking enough advice from others, or you're not seeing enough different perspectives. So I think it's very, very important, I think, as a leader, to try and take the time to kind of sit back. And we would talk about, in the military, big hands, little map, like look at the big kind of picture, sit back in that big leather armchair and kind of look at the map and just take time. Whereas what I see, and I think it's pervaded the military even now, is just, you see a bunch of senior leaders whose diary is just effectively kind of full. It's like they're going from one meeting to the next meeting to the next meeting to the next meeting. And you look at their calendar for the week and they have no free space. They have no time to just sit back kind of almost without interruption, or just have that kind of chance to like just look at the big map and go, what are the kind of big problems? I mean, I always joke with my wife, like I do my best thinking in the shower, like I solve all my problems or all the world's problems kind of in the shower. I think it's in part because, like I'm not being interrupted. I'm kind of in an environment that doesn't kind of have any interruptions. I've just got water flowing over me, so I'm probably kind of nice and relaxed, and my brain's just got a chance uninterrupted to kind of do that. I don't think that a lot of senior leaders are allowing themselves the time to sit back so that their brain can kind of, process some of what they need to process. Steve Jobs and some of those other kind of guys out of Silicon Valley used to talk about, he would wear the same t-shirt kind of every day because he's like, that's one less decision that I have to make. And, now I think there's a whole lot of body of work coming out talking about, kind of decision fatigue. By 7 o'clock in the morning, if you've picked up your phone, you've maybe scrolled social media or what have you, your brain has to make a decision on every single post it sees. Am I going to stop? Am I going to keep scrolling? Am I going to read that? There's, 7 decisions just on all of that. The more that we can just free our minds of, again, why we should just get off social media, a separate conversation. The more we can free our minds of some of those distractions, the same in a meeting sense, remove some of those meetings and just give ourselves some, what I would call kind of strategic space to sit back and make sure that we're actually kind of just taking it all in without having to feel like I have to kind of make a decision every kind of 3 seconds. So I think there's definitely, and there's, plenty of psychological research around that says, moving yourself to a different environment, getting away from some of those distractions allows you some of that kind of free thinking space. So I think in a military environment, especially in the conduct of warfare, some of those senior leaders can just be so, like it's such a fast-paced kind of environment. You think you're kind of having to make decisions the whole time, but as a result, you can get so close to the problem that you do kind of lose some of that objectivity, or you have stopped taking input from a range of different sources that maybe you just kind of actually need to slow down and listen to, and maybe you don't. Sure, the decision ultimately rests on you. And I think a lot of leaders can feel like I've just got to kind of make a snap decision or I have to do it, versus sitting back and going, you know what, maybe I just need another 5 minutes or a couple of extra perspectives to think about this. And that's okay. Because I think, there can be a tendency by a lot of, people in leadership positions to think that they have to be seen to have the answers, because, I can't let the troops see that I don't know the answer right now. And there's some issues around that too, but you don't want to be seen as kind of a dithering leader that no one can kind of trust and that can't actually make decisions when you need to. But equally, I think you need to show your people that, hey, I am open to feedback. I am open to trying to, get other ideas and perspectives. And so I think it's a balance, right? Like most things in life, everything is a balance, but you've got to make sure you don't kind of get too skewed towards, ignoring some of those other kind of perspectives. And that might just be as simple as, right, I'm blocking out my diary. I'm just going for a walk, here in Canberra, right? I'm just going to go for a walk around the lake, and I think that's okay. Whereas I think, there's this expectation that, well, if I'm not in a meeting kind of, and going from one to the next and making decisions, actually you do need a bit of free space. Yeah.
In today's modern world, we have lots of jargon we use. Leaders speak about evidence-backed decisions or evidence-informed decisions. There's a lot of data dashboarding that happens, very little data literacy that exists. A lot of the time we say we want to do collaboration, but we don't really listen. We ask for stuff, we don't really listen. And I don't think our leaders today don't know these things. I think we need to be reminded more than we need to be taught. But what are some of those markers, Scott, that you have seen in your leadership journey? Yes, you know what needs to happen. You need to take just a few minutes to take a break, take a breather. But there are these 6 other things that are demanding your attention. What are those personal markers that leaders need to be mindful of that'll give them a little, hey, I need a reset now?
Yeah, probably that's. I think there's probably a couple of ways I would answer that. One is, I have a lot of tools in my toolbox, if you want to call it that way, that are based around I remember things really, really well when they're kind of in threes, and a lot of little kind of tools I think that I have are based off kind of 3 letters or 3 words that kind of form an acronym. And one of them that I have is 3 Ds, which is delete, delegate, or do. And so, when an email comes in or an issue comes in, can I just delete that? Like, is it spam? Is it just someone trying to pitch me? Is it, something that I don't really need to actually action, so I can just delete it? Or do I need to actually, no, something does need to happen about this. Can I delegate it? Is that something that I can actually delegate to somebody else? It might be a team member, or it might be that we need to outsource that, or what have you. Or is it something that I just actually need to do? And so that, delete, delegate, or do is a really, really quick and easy way of thinking about something, about whether this is actually something that I need to do. A lot of people tend to jump, just by default, they jump to the do bit versus actually sitting down and saying, can that just be deleted? Is that just a distraction? Or can someone else kind of take care of that? So yeah, that little delete, delegate, or do is a good little kind of check on that. So that's one way I would answer the question. I think the other one is, I'm very big on routine and where you can. And so I think, the way I try to think about it is that, where you can, I know some leaders that literally just, they will block out parts of their diary, and their EA knows that you cannot see Scott. I don't have an EA, but, at the moment, but it's like Scott is just unavailable between 2 and 4 o'clock every Thursday afternoon. It's just, you can't get him, because that's time that, that, person has set aside, I think, there's some leaders, kind of talk about, my office door is always open. You can kind of always come and see me. And like, it kind of sounds good, but I think, as a leader, you also have to kind of prioritize yourself. So I'm a very, big believer that, as a leader, you need to kind of be thinking about other people. But the caveat on that is you can't take care of other people if you're not taking care of yourself. And so whether that be from a mental health point of view, whether it be from, your own education, like, you should be spending time each week trying to do some professional reading that is about furthering yourself, furthering your own understanding, whether it be about leadership or the particular area or industry that you're now working in. So you have to kind of focus and continue to improve yourself in order to be able to look after the people that are under your care. And so I think, there can be a tendency if you're focused on the right thing, i.e. I'm focused on, looking after the people that I'm responsible for, that you kind of forget about yourself. And so part of my answer too is around making sure that you are quite deliberate around making sure that you are, performing at the best that you can perform, because that's the way you can best serve those that are under you. And if you're not focusing on your own performance and setting yourself up in the best way for success, whether you're eating right, whether you're making sure that you're exercising right, are you fully hydrated, all those kind of like just basic little kind of things. Have you got a bunch of things that are in place to make sure that, hey, when you do get busy, you don't, the number of people that I talk to, they're like, I've been so busy today, I kind of forgot to have lunch. How did you forget to have lunch? Like, your body has been telling you at least some point in this afternoon that I'm kind of hungry. How did you kind of forget that, versus saying, I'm actually going to deliberately kind of structure my day. I'm going to, when I get to work, I'm going to go to the water fountain and I'm going to fill up my water bottle and make sure that I start my day with a full water bottle and that I want it empty by the end of the day, and that have made my diary so that it's right. I have got, even if it's just a small time, but I've actually allocated time for lunch. If you haven't had time for lunch and you've had a really, really busy day, chances are that if you've got a bunch of, staff that are working around you who are supporting you in terms of your executive team or something like that, that maybe they haven't either. So like, if you're not leading by example and setting the scene that says to them, hey, it's really, really important that despite how busy we are and how much we think we're under the pump, we all need to actually, take some time and make sure that we're doing that. Because if you're not doing that, you're not setting an example for them. And so, I'm a fundamental kind of, leadership principle for me is around leading by example. Like, if you don't do the right thing and you don't do that, you can't expect those, who are working for you to kind of do it either. So it's really, really important for that to be visible, to those that are around you, and that you prioritize that, and therefore that they should be prioritizing that. And so, that's another aspect that I think, from a leadership point of view, that people really need to focus on is, I need to take kind of care of myself, but also I need to show other people that they need to kind of be taking care of themselves too. So there's a few aspects to that question. Yeah.
In your own personal life, running a business, being a dad, being a husband, there are lots of demands on your time, on your attention. What's that one non-negotiable for Scott to show up at his best, to improve 1% every day? What's that one non-negotiable in your life?
So for me, it's exercise. And every time that exercise starts to kind of, if it falls away, then I notice it, you know what I mean? So for me, I'm a much better person if I exercise, and it kind of almost in a sense doesn't matter what I do. Like, so for me historically, like I've never really, like from the time I was a kid, I've never really liked running. But if I go for a run, because I don't really like running, I've got better as I get older in a sense. But, it used to be particularly that, if I went for a run, I would be thinking about, when I go for a run, I'm thinking about running. Like, I'm thinking about trying to push myself. I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about running. Guess what? If you've gone for, even if you've just gone for a 20-minute or 30-minute run, you've spent 30 minutes not thinking about whatever other kind of problem that maybe you were trying to deal with or solve. Now, I do a range, I exercise in lots of different ways. But what I find is whenever I'm exercising, I'm thinking about doing whatever it is that I'm doing at the time. Because it's you're very kind of task focused in that sense. It's like, right, I'm doing this. Or if you're doing it with, a trainer or something like that, or a group of other people, you're very focused on, what are we trying to do? We're, together. And then you realize you kind of, get to the end of maybe an hour or something, you're kind of hot, sweaty, and you're like, I haven't thought about the business, or I haven't thought about the kids, or I haven't thought about whatever it was for like that hour. I've just been focused on doing that. And so for me, that if I don't have that enough in my life, then other things start to kind of fall off. So for me, and I've probably learnt this lesson a few times in my life, in the sense that I'll relearnt it if you want, perhaps, is that every time I kind of get too busy and I kind of get too not overwhelmed, but I just kind of get too consumed by work. If some of those things like that, and for me, it's exercise. If that starts to fall off, I didn't make time for exercise today. Like I was talking about some people that I didn't have time for lunch. If I get to the point where it's like, I didn't have time for exercise, then, that kind of cumulative effect, miss it once, that's okay. But, if you start to make that becomes a new habit. So for me, making a routine and habit around, so now I have in my diary, it's like, right, I'm doing, this at this time, and I diarize it so that it's like, it's in the diary. And then, my wife knows, because we share kind of, personal kind of diaries, beauty of, modern technology. It's like, right, Scott's just out then, and it's like, it's kind of a bit of a non-negotiable. Now, obviously, if I go away, I'm traveling or what have you, it can change, but, by diarizing that, it just means that, and making it a non-negotiable, that's not, you can't kind of move it, just, it forces it to happen. And then guess what happens when you start to do that? It becomes a habit, and then, habits are a lot harder to break once you start to form them, so, making things a habit, great book by James Clear, I think it is, around atomic
habits. Yeah.
One of the things that he talks about, in terms of how do you kind of make habits, one of the things he talks about is make it obvious. And that might be, if you want to read more, well, leave a book, on your pillow, so that you will, that night when you come to bed, it's kind of on your pillow and you read it. Another way that you can do it in terms of making it obvious is, it's like, right, it's in my diary. I kind of need to do it. It's diarized, and so it's going to happen. So that's kind of how I kind of think about some of that.
From building a career in a field that you were deeply passionate about, something you said, hey, Dad, I want to be a pilot. From that career to transitioning into landscape photography, help me understand, how was that passion formed?
Yeah, so not what I expected. So, that kind of younger version of myself that thought I was going to join the Air Force as a pilot and kind of retire as Chief of Air Force, that's definitely not how it transpired. But I guess as I look back on it, each kind of step that was a shift from that kind of made sense at the time, in the sense that, I'd spent 10 years in the military. I'd, done quite well in terms of the area that I was in. I'd got to then go and do, Iraq in the Middle East. I felt like I'd kind of got to the point where, I had achieved a lot in that kind of 10-year career. And I felt like now I needed another kind of challenge. Went and joined the public service. And then when I was in the public service, I just had a crazy work-life balance. And I still remember, like, it was one Sunday, I'd, broken up with a girlfriend at the time. I'd just flown back from overseas. I was about to fly out, again the next morning. And I was in at work, trying to do whatever admin I needed to do around that. And I was like, my mates are either kind of, all at the pub, or they're out rock climbing, or doing what have you. And it kind of dawned on me that my entire life was kind of dominated by work. And, we would say, these days, my work-life balance was totally all work and no life. And it kind of dawned on me that I needed to kind of address that. And there was this print on the wall by a photographer called Ken Duncan that, kind of took Australian landscape photos. And I was like, wouldn't it be awesome if you just traveled around Australia and took landscape photos? Like, that's pretty much how it started. And I didn't know anything about landscape photography. I didn't know about anything about running a business per se or anything like that. So essentially, I went and bought a bunch of books on photography, and I was like, so a digital sensor, in a camera works the same way a FLIR does, Hornet. I kind of understand that, right? If you do this aperture, it equals that, from a physics kind of point of view, I was probably a little bit quite, X equals Y type thing. And then I went and, started taking some photos. So I bought, I went and splashed out, bought a bunch of photography gear, and then people were like, hey, these are all right. You should think about selling them. So essentially, it kind of started as a little kind of what we would call a side hustle. And then now it's grown into what it has, where, we're a national business, selling Australian landscape photos to, people in Australia and overseas. But it started as that little kind of, side hustle. Then ultimately I left the public service, and I actually went full time into the business. But I was not earning anywhere near as much as I would have liked, because I had obviously stepped away from, relatively kind of successful kind of career options there. took a massive pay cut in terms of running my own business, and it was very up and down. And what I realized at that juncture was that I thought that I was taking okay photos, but I didn't really understand the business aspects enough. So I ended up joining a management consulting firm called Booz & Company, which were like a top-tier global management consulting firm at the time. And I feel like, and in my first 12 months there, I kind of crammed an MBA into that year in terms of just what I learned about business and, the ways to kind of look and analyze businesses. And what happened in that first 12 months was I realized suddenly, and I don't know why I hadn't come to this realization sooner, but I suddenly realized that everything that I'd learned in the military, the systems, the frameworks and methodologies around a whole lot of things, I could actually apply to kind of business. What I feel like happened is when I left the military and I joined the public service, I feel like for me, the public service was just very, very anti-military. They were like, I don't give a, I don't want to hear about that. And I kind of got some of the military kind of thinking kind of got beaten out of me almost in a way. It wasn't accepted. It wasn't welcome. It just wasn't what people wanted to kind of hear about or know. And so I think I probably repressed a bunch of that in a sense. And as a result, when I then kind of came to running the business, I kind of forgot to then apply a bunch of that. And suddenly I think when I got out and I joined Booz, I realized that, hey, I can actually apply this. This is actually applicable. So that was brilliant. And I don't know why it took me that to kind of, come to that realization. But then as a result, I then really started to apply what I kind of knew and some of them what I was learning at Booz to the business. So I was full-time in Booz, running the business on the side. And, then as a result, started to kind of grow it, I think, because now I had a bit more of an idea of what I needed to be doing on the business front. And then ultimately, did management consulting there for a while. Then I joined, for a bunch of reasons. Basically, Booz got bought out by PwC, and there was a kind of changeover there. Ended up joining the management team on a smaller, more boutique firm. I went there part-time, which basically meant I worked 5 days a week instead of 7. But then, I was kind of running, the business was kind of growing a bit more. And then ultimately then left there and then went full-time when we opened the gallery. And so that was about 8 years ago now. So I think we're in our 8th year of having a gallery. So what has kind of happened there, you can see kind of a bit of a non-linear path, some success, a whole lot of not success, setbacks, failures, but just, again, what I kind of keep talking about, that kind of patience, that long-term kind of thing, So we're now, it's probably more than not quite 20, but, over 15 years of having this business in one form or another. So a good example, I think, probably of that need for kind of patience, perseverance, and a bit of determination over that period of time to kind of get to where we have, So, we have not got the business to where we have now, overnight. It's definitely been, a challenging journey at times, definitely ups and downs. But I think, that kind of perseverance to kind of keep sticking at it. So we're definitely not an overnight success in that regard. So that is very, very different to, that kind of young kid wanting to join the Air Force as a pilot. But I think for me, what has happened is that was one aspect of kind of motivation and things that drove me. And I still have an interest in aviation and flying. I could fly a plane at 16 before I could drive a car, So I kind of joke that, it kind of started early for me. And now I'm experiencing aviation and flying in a different way, whether that be flying a drone or taking photos out the side of a helicopter, over different parts of Australia or whatever. So I'm still kind of entertaining that interest in that aspect of aviation in what I do. But now I'm actually, running a business with all the joys and challenges that come with that. And then I'm getting to, have an awesome excuse to get out and travel and see Australia. So I've found, I think, something where I'm able to kind of appeal to lots of different aspects of my motivation around an interest in aviation, an interest in running a business and leadership and trying to manage a team, though it's a lot smaller than what I had in the past, but still, dealing with people, and then actually getting out and taking landscape photos. So it's funny that sometimes, you realize that we kind of have multiple interests or multiple passions, and I've been able to somehow find one or find a kind of vocation in a way that's kind of combined a whole lot of those in one. So quite lucky that I've been able to kind of pull all that together in one. But yeah, definitely not what I thought I would be doing given how my kind of career out of school started. Yeah.
You spoke about you mentioned the difficult parts of the business. So when you first started taking photos when you first started having those for sale, not all of Australia is going to come running and going, hey, I want a picture or I want a frame. You open the gallery, and once you start building, foot traffic into that, we have something called a pandemic that happens. What do those moments, Scott, teach you about running a business?
Probably a couple of things. So, if you go back to the first bit that you said, not everyone comes running. I think you could have the best photographs of Australia ever. And you could maybe have the best collection of photographs, but if no one knows about it, no one's going to buy it, so you could have the best product, you could be the best, I don't know, make the best widget ever, and you're the best engineer that is, and you've solved a problem. But if you don't have an ability to get that to market it, to get it in front of an audience, to kind of explain it, have an ability for them. We were talking, now, I mean, online retail is nothing like what it was when I first started, the business. But, you've got to have an ability for people to be able to, buy that product too so sure, you can market it, but if they don't have an easy ability to buy it, in the old days you had to have a shop, or it was mail order, or whatever the case was, but now it's online, in one sense versus, or in store. But you've got to have that ability to be able to get the product, get your service, if that's what you're doing, out to the market at scale. And I think certainly something that I struggled with early on was, awesome, now I've got a bunch of photographs, I've got a product, in terms of, framed prints or whatever the case may be, but how do I actually get that in front of people? How do we actually turn this into a truly national brand where people from all over Australia want to buy that? Then the second bit of that is, okay, well, maybe now we're not at that point, but, a whole lot of people in Australia, know who we are, but how do they now actually purchase it and have trust? And that then obviously means you've got to have a logistics and distribution network in place to how do I actually, get all these products. We're selling large framed prints, so it's not like you can just, wrap it up in a little Australia Post box and, and off it goes. So, all those other aspects that you have to now start to think about from a business around, fulfillment, logistics, suppliers, supply chain, all of those, contributing factors that go to actually now getting this product out to people. So, your first challenge for any business is, well, how do I come up with a product or a service? How do I kind of continue to refine that? Now, how do I kind of get it to market? Okay, now how do I actually deliver on that? If it's a service-based business, how do I build a team? How do I get people to kind of deliver on that consistently in line with our brand and so forth? So, I think what a lot of people don't appreciate in business is that as you solve one problem, you've just now, and if you're being successful, you're opening the door to 3 other problems, in the sense that, okay, now we're growing, now we've got a whole lot more people. How do we recruit the right people? How do we kind of train people? How do we do all that? Okay, now I've got that. Now we've got bigger HR workplace problems. Now we've got greater industrial relations. BHP, doesn't have any less problems than, a much smaller business, right? The problems just get more, and they kind of get bigger and more zeros on the end. So I kind of like that aspect that, every day I'm just kind of solving new problems. So I think there's that realization, especially early on, that how do we actually kind of get that out there and kind of grow? And then, you talk about things like, the pandemic, often then things come along that you don't foresee, or that are problems that maybe aren't along what you would define as a typical kind of business journey. So I would definitely say that kind of COVID and the pandemic and the restrictions. So COVID itself didn't have any impact on the business. What had an impact on the business was the government restrictions and things that are in place. And so, now you're dealing with a different regulatory environment that is ultimately, in our case, for the gallery, was then meant that we didn't have any foot traffic because people couldn't get out and we were forced to shut and things like that. But, equally, we were, you've got to think about how you deal with that regulatory environment. So as an example, and I'm happy to kind of talk about this now, but, when regulations first came out, galleries had to shut. So one of the first things that had to shut was a bunch of, public spaces, hairdressers, beauty salons. Shops were still allowed to open. So, the galleries had to shut. So I remember we had outsourced social media at the time. And I remember one of the girls literally kind of contacting us, kind of a bit stressed that night. Hey, we're going to put together a post to say that you're going to be shut tomorrow because, tonight, as of midnight tonight, galleries have to shut. I'm like, we're not a gallery. We're a shop. we're a retail shop. No, but we're a shop. How do we kind of navigate that retail? How do we navigate that regulatory environment? So it was like, sitting down and going, well, in theory, as a gallery, we were meant to shut, but no, we're a retail shop. So how do you kind of navigate those regulations? The kind of reverse happened later when the second round of restrictions happened. Is because they were the second round of restrictions were way more, like probably about 12 months later, were way more kind of restrictive. So what happened was all shops had to shut, but there was a provision in there that galleries, that staff were allowed to continue to go in galleries because galleries needed to protect their artworks and you might need to deal with air conditioning or what have you. So I was like, we're good to go. We're a gallery, So in Kingston, every shop was tearing their hair out because they couldn't go in, they couldn't fulfill online orders because, they were a retail shop and the staff weren't even allowed to go into the shop to fulfill online orders. I was like, well, we're a gallery. So we were like going in, fulfilling online orders because we were doing puzzles and all this kind of stuff. So that's an example of, well, kind of how do we kind of, work the regulatory environment in a way that's in our favor. So again, you're kind of solving a range of those different kind of challenges. Now, some people argue that we're kind of, pushing the limits on that a little bit around how we're kind of playing that. But
you have to push.
But, from a business point of view, you've kind of got to do what you got to do to try and kind of survive. Which is why then, I think the speed at which you do that matters. So I talk about, what I think is critical when some of these kind of things happen is around the speed at which you make decisions or the speed at how you kind of adapt. And so, in the Air Force, in our particular kind of setting, we always talked about the fact that he with the shortest OODA loop wins. So the ability to observe, orient, decide, and then act. If you can observe, orient, decide, and act quicker than your adversary, then you will win. And that's, kind of been true, across warfare for some time in that sense and in life, I think. And so, I've definitely adapted that methodology to business in the sense that our ability to observe, orient, decide, and act quicker than someone else will put us in good stead, or just, to adapt more kind of quickly than government regulations might be able to. So, if the government has brought out that, our ability to kind of quickly observe, orient, and decide around, well, what do the restrictions allow? Is there any, provisions there that we can kind of work around versus just the immediate kind of, I'm just going to react, which was the social media, team at the time. And that's no criticism of them because that wasn't their job, right? They were actually being front-footed and doing a good job. So that's not a criticism of them. But it just shows you the kind of difference in terms of approach that says, oh, shit, you guys have got shut. They were being really, really proactive and having a very short OODA loop themselves around saying, hey, we'll be front-footed and tell everyone that you've kind of got a shut and do that on social media. Whereas the business perspective means, hang on, no, we haven't actually fully orientated what this is. The orientation kind of bit of this says, well, hey, the regulations are kind of not permitting, galleries, but they are permitting retail stores. So, well, we're a retail store. So actually there is a provision for us to not have to shut and so forth. And then they're obviously the reverse later on. So that ability to not just, I think the tendency for some people can be to not overreact, but to kind of jump to the wrong conclusion because they haven't kind of oriented first. But equally, I think, and this is a really good example for us as well, is, we were quite early in jigsaw puzzles. So part of our response to the kind of first lot of lockdowns was we could see, in terms of that observe and orient bit of the OODA loop, we could see that restrictions were happening overseas. We could see that probably the same thing was going to happen in Australia, that there were probably going to be lockdowns occurring. We're running a physical retail store. We're probably going to have to shut. That's probably coming our way. Not yet, but it's probably coming our way because it's happening everywhere else. So, likelihood there. Okay, what is that going to mean? How are we going to continue to operate as a business? What's that going to mean in a society sense? If everyone's sitting at home, is there anything that we're able to do as a business to meet a new need or a more pressing need that maybe the population writ large kind of has? So we made the decision to kind of go down the path of, well, why don't we bring out jigsaw puzzles? If everyone's sitting at home and they're locked down, we might be able to offer a product that people want or need. So we decided to pursue jigsaw puzzles, and we do everything in terms of like our products are made in Australia where we can. So we managed to find a supplier in Australia. They're pretty much the only supplier at the time that made jigsaw puzzles in Australia because everything else was made in China. got a bunch of samples and essentially decided to kind of go ahead with that. So my wife always jokes that, she had to convince me to start cutting my photos into 1,000 pieces. But the irony on this is, again, this is where, again, our social media kind of team at the time was awesome, is we got them up, I kid you not, 3 hours before ScoMo said, I declared jigsaw puzzles an essential item. Because it was at a press conference or something like that. And someone said, because at the time people were allowed to leave home for essential items. And someone said, oh, well, give me an example of something that's not food that's an essential item. And I think he said something along the lines of, well, my wife, Jenny, last night went and bought some jigsaw puzzles for the girls because I know that, we're going to be locked home. So I consider jigsaw puzzles an essential item. So I did I don't use Facebook that much personally. And so I did a cheeky Facebook post on my personal page that said something like, ScoMo just declared jigsaw puzzles an essential item. Look what we just launched. Cue the panic buying of jigsaw puzzles. And within, I kid you not, like 5 or 10 minutes, we started selling jigsaw puzzles from friends that were on Facebook that then wanted to kind of support us and things like that. So it had been our ability to kind of do that, observe and orient and decide and act around doing jigsaw puzzles in the preceding weeks to kind of see what was going on in the environment that allowed us to kind of be well positioned. And then we rode a wave of essentially kind of jigsaw puzzle mania. We got a whole lot of then national media coverage. So we were selling jigsaw puzzles like crazy. So that's all well and good. But then we ran into other problems. The supplier couldn't keep up because, everyone in Australia was trying to get jigsaw puzzles from them. Then we ran into border closures where the freight companies couldn't cross the border. So then, my mum and dad lived in Victoria. They were in the border bubble so they could cross the border. So I was going down to Holbrook, literally, I was joking like a drug swap out of his 4-wheel drive of all these jigsaw puzzles into the back of ours. We'd turned our lounge room into a fulfillment center. I'd turn up with the 4-wheel drive full of jigsaw puzzles. We'd pack them all up and then basically next morning then go to Australia Post and like rinse and repeat. So again, your ability to kind of quickly act. The interesting part of that story is, I kid you not, like 6 or 9 months later, we started getting emails because obviously then we got a bit of media coverage around what we'd done. We started getting emails from essentially competitors saying, oh, I'm thinking about doing kind of jigsaw puzzles. Like, where do you get your jigsaw puzzles made? So firstly, my response is like, go away. Like, you're a competitor and go away. But secondly, it's like, mate, you're kind of 6 or 9 months late to the party. Like it's kind of happened and you're on the back end of it and you've kind of missed it. So that is a really good example of, a bunch of people that were 6 or 9 months too slow in their OODA loop. If you go back to that kind of military analogy, where they just kind of missed it. The opportunity had passed. So by the time that a bunch of people had decided to then go, oh, Scott's doing pretty well with jigsaw puzzles, maybe I should do that as well. Like, they were kind of too like they'd missed the jigsaw puzzle wave. Like, we'd already ridden it and it kind of was over, because again, once the restrictions came off, people didn't have a need for jigsaw puzzles anymore. So, the amount of sales of jigsaw puzzles during that kind of period was, exponentially above what the normal kind of baseline rate is. And now it's gone back to probably a pretty standard level. So if you're not quick to kind of, make those decisions, see what's going on and make a decision, then you will get left behind because a competitor, and that's what, I think I've realized from a military point of view, we're always talking about, well, how do we kind of outdo the adversary and then the adversary gets a say in this? Well, in a marketplace, in a commercial sense, well, your competitors get a say in this. Like, we're all competing, there's a limited amount of pie. And I think a lot of businesses don't realize that we're actually kind of all competing for that kind of same amount of pie. And if you don't move first, someone else will move first. And then if you don't respond to that. So, that is a really good example, I think, of how businesses need to kind of be prepared to move quick, but they do need that opportunity to sit back, kind of assess what's going on in the environment and go from there. So I think that kind of mentality, that kind of thinking has worked for us and continues to, even now. It's like, there is a big shift going on in the economy and here in the ACT or what have you, workers, we can, as a business, I can lament the fact that I get frustrated that all workers aren't back in the office and that because they're not back in the office, they're then not going out and eating lunch, or maybe visiting, areas at lunchtime. So therefore foot traffic is down. People aren't spending in the way they were. We can complain about kind of interest rates and the fact that there's a cost of living crisis and all this kind of stuff. And so therefore people aren't spending as much. So therefore for us as a business, we're kind of getting impacted. I could kind of sit there and just kind of whinge about that. Or I can sit there and say, okay, is this a fundamental shift in terms of what's going on in the economy? Is this a temporary thing? Like what is going on? And I can spend 12 or 18 months or 2 years trying to make that assessment, or can I kind of shorten that time frame and go, okay, is this something that's fundamental that's kind of changing the economy? Whether I like the government's decision around certain things or not, it kind of is what it is, and I'm not going to change that as a one-man band. But what can I do about it? Like, do I need to shift and alter my business? Do I need to change things around how we're running our business? Do I need to kind of evolve? Because if I just sit there and wait for too long, then, the world will have kind of moved on. And so those businesses at the moment that are able to kind of move from the, oh, I'm a victim, the world's all kind of shifted and I don't like it and the government shouldn't be doing this. Well, that's an avenue. But, the other avenue I would argue is go, okay, well, what you've got to work out is this a kind of permanent change to the way people kind of operate and the economy more broadly? Where are we in that economic cycle? Like, do you actually need to start to shift your business and adapt to that, or do you just write it out? That's the kind of mentality and thinking that I think I probably now bring from a military perspective and go, hey, I've got to be kind of quick. I've got to be the first one that recognizes what this shift is and then works out what the answer is. Now, I haven't necessarily worked out what the answer is yet, but there is an answer there that says, I mean, we're doing a few things to kind of respond to the moment, but that's the key is like, I've got to, because if I don't work it out, someone else will work it out and they'll kind of beat us to it. And that's what I mean. The adversary gets an impact, gets a say, or in our case, our competitor gets a say too, right? So if they're the first to do it or a bunch of other competitors start moving a particular way, then we're playing catch up versus being the first to start to do it and have an advantage. So you've got to, and I think, that's not necessarily a military approach necessarily, but I think the military mindset that I think I've been given certainly helps me in that thinking to be better placed to deal with that. Whereas I see a lot of other people, often in my industry who aren't prepared to kind of take the risk or be the first to kind of move or to adapt or change. They're so busy worrying about, this is, going back to kind of some of your earlier question about, how much people kind of look on social media and stuff like that. People are so busy worrying about what everyone else is doing that they're afraid to kind of be the first person that tries and does something different. And if you just are busy emulating and looking at what everyone else is doing to achieve their success, well, you're not going to achieve anything different than what they're doing. And so I think it's really, really incumbent upon business leaders, no matter what industry they're in, to think about, how do I have a shorter OODA loop and what systems and processes can I put in place to kind of support that? And what does that mean around, a culture? And, a big one for us is around debriefing, and this is again at that kind of very Air Force kind of pilot, approach to things where you debrief every activity. We should be debriefing all our activities. And if you're debriefing that, then you're feeding back in and making a kind of quicker learning circle, which obviously then helps with a quicker OODA loop too, as a business. So the more that you can debrief activities, the more that you can apply those lessons learned, then you're going to be in an advantage over other competitors in whatever industry you're in. And so that we're seeing in the corporate world, probably more so in the US than in Australia, where a lot of big corporates now are starting to look at some of that military kind of approach and go, how do we bring a bunch of ex-military guys in to kind of teach us how to kind of do some of this stuff? Because they recognize that, look, we are moving in an increasingly fast changing world. I mean, you look at where AI is now, just compared to where AI was 12, it was only kind of 12 or 18 months ago that ChatGPT came around. And now look, like, it is transforming businesses. And if you're not using a bunch of AI platforms now, you are literally being left behind and at a complete disadvantage. Now, we can sit here and have an ethical or moral argument about, the rights and wrongs or ills or not of AI and so forth. But what you can't dismiss is that it is, really powerful and going to change the game, or has already changed the game. And you can be an early or a late adopter, and or you can be a person that says, okay, I get that AI, how do I have a kind of quick OODA loop on this that says, okay, well, where are the opportunities for us? Like, how can we actually leverage AI for our business? How can we use it as a tool, or how can we use it to, boost the workforce and the productivity that we have, versus, like, I get it, let's just wait for it to mature a bit or what have you. Well, the one that's kind of got the one that's quicker at that in terms of the shorter OODA loop, I believe, will be far better positioned, far better advantaged to capitalize on that. And then everyone else will be playing catch up. And so, that's a really good example. And I don't think the world's going to start changing any slower anytime soon. AI, everyone's holding out a whole lot of hope on quantum. I think, in terms of quantum computing and things like that, I think that's probably, maybe a little bit further away and may not, generate exactly everything that people perhaps hope for, certainly early on. But again, once that kind of starts to land, if people aren't on that straight away, those that are going to be at a massive advantage to those that aren't. So I think, that speed at which you can adapt is really, really critical. But I think what's important out of that, and the lesson that I would say to other business leaders, is don't confuse a short or a quick OODA loop just with making snap decisions, though. And because the key to, that OODA loop is that ability to kind of, to observe and orient. And I don't think people, they just jump to the decision, oh, look, I'm good, I can just make a snap decision. They haven't actually spent enough time orientating to actually understand, well, are there examples of where this has or hasn't worked before? What examples are out there in my own experience or from, a historical perspective that we can kind of leverage other lessons learned? How does this look? What's happened when transformation in a technology sense has happened before? Are there lessons that we can draw out of that we could apply now? So having a short OODA loop doesn't mean making snap decisions. And I think that's something that some people kind of miss in that. They think it just means being really, really decisive and just saying and kind of acting quickly. It actually means that you then have to also act quickly, because often, senior leaders can make a decision, right, we're going to go down this particular path, but then the action or the implementation, might take, a long, long time. So you might have been quite good at, observing, orientating, deciding, but then if your implementation is then going to be 18 months, mate, there was no point being really, really kind of quick in the first bit if now you're going to take so long to implement. So the entirety of that OODA loop, that matters, not just the first bit.
Scott, you've given us lots of insights in terms of running a business and how you apply lots of structure and discipline and a keen eye to it. I want to touch on the creative side of it, because not all the time will that creativity align with structure. Tell me about the inner critic in you when you take a picture. A lot of time people go, oh, are you worried about putting out a picture, a piece of work out there and what people will say? I'm like, no, because if you only know how critical I am of my own work, tell me about the inner critic when you take a picture.
I don't know that I have an inner critic as such, but I go the process is very, very simple in my mind. I basically look at a scene. So firstly, I guess, take one step back. I'm spending a whole lot of time either researching or spending time outdoors to try and find a scene or try and explore things. But the critic bit is just, I have a really simple question that I just ask myself, and that is, would someone pay to put this on their wall? So you and I might go, go on a hike somewhere, and I'm like, I want to go and shoot something on the summit of this hill. And we get there, and you might be like, hey, Scott, that tree looks kind of cool, but it looks kind of cool, but it's dead. And you're like, oh, that would look good because it's kind of all this kind of, weird shape or something like that. And I just ask myself a simple question that is like, would someone pay to put that on their wall? And, it might be that in that case, I'm like, mate, it's just a dead tree and it's kind of a bit dark and depressing and it kind of looks cool with a light behind it, but ultimately it's a bit kind of dark and depressing or something like that. I don't think someone's going to pay to put that by choice on their wall. So that's pretty much the process that goes through my mind in a creative sense. I'm like, would someone pay to put this on their wall? Because ultimately what I'm doing is trying to capture a photo that someone's going to want to pay us money for, as a framed print on their wall. So that's really the kind of question that keeps going through that process. So now maybe I found something that I think someone would pay to put on their wall. And now I'm all set up. I've got the tripod set up, the camera, and now I'm essentially just waiting for the light to happen. Because most of what I photograph is around sunrise or sunset, because that's just when you normally get, terrific light and things like that. But you don't get a great sunrise or sunset every day. So I'm kind of out there, waiting for that one time when it is that really kind of good one. Or if it's not a really good one, is it still light that, showcases the scene in the way that I want? And so sometimes I will go out, and I probably increasingly do this now, where I don't even take a photo. I'll be like, just it hasn't happened. Now, either hasn't happened because either I was suffering essentially a creativity deficit on that day for whatever reason, that I just couldn't find an angle or the subject, or I couldn't get it to answer that question, properly. Or I reckon I had the perfect subject, I had the composition just right, but the light just totally fell flat and sunrise just didn't happen in terms of light. And I'm like, I don't need. Obviously, the beauty about digital now is you can take as many photos as you want, but equally, I don't even bother taking a photo if I know that it's not going to be right. The reverse of that, though, is sometimes it just like it goes off. I'm like, scenery is amazing, the light's fantastic, and I'm just like, I'm pumped. But then, when I get home and I just look at it on the screen, I'm just like, I'm just not feeling it, in the sense that so much of what I probably felt at the time was so many of those other external factors. And what happens is when you bring something down to just a photograph, your brain is only interpreting what it can actually see, which is just a very limited, perspective on whatever scene and how you've chosen to compose it. When I'm out and sunrise is going off, I'm maybe, a bit euphoric because I've just, hiked up this hill really, really quickly. I'm kind of a bit puffed, and I'm, stoked that I got there just in time for sunset because I left too late or whatever the case may be. And the birds are singing, and maybe I'm with someone else and we're just like, how kind of cool is this? And I can kind of see things in the shadows that then maybe the, camera can't or whatever. And so you kind of look at the ultimate photo and you're like, it's not conveying what I was kind of feeling at the time. And I'm like, well, if I'm not then seeing it, then I can't expect someone else to. So again, I kind of come back to that question is, would someone pay money to put that on their wall? So that's the kind of critical kind of path that I really kind of go through in a critical sense, that I'm just like, is that good enough? And is it up to kind of my standard that I think someone would pay for? So that's how that kind of process works in my mind.
What's your most popular photograph?
Got a couple that are probably up there as my most popular. So I think I've got my most popular photos are probably a combination of, so I've got two things that I'm probably known for is a bunch of my snow and alpine and snow gum photos. So I've got a couple of, snow gum and alpine shots that are really, really popular. And then I've got a couple of Canberra ones as well. And that's probably because we've got a gallery in Canberra. And so we've kind of probably got a bit more of an audience amongst Canberra, but certainly in a national sense, probably more of the snow gum and alpine ones, which I love because, part of, I guess, we talk about as a business, we're about people experiencing Australia, so our, what we are about is allowing people to experience Australia through, photographs. And what that means is often, I might be capturing a photograph that due to age or physical limitations or just where people live or whatever, they may not have had the chance to kind of experience, or, maybe they're too old to climb up a mountain and actually see that for themselves, but they're able to kind of experience that through my photos. So I love the fact that I can kind of share scenes that maybe people don't normally often associate with Australia too. So a lot of the snow and alpine ones, we have, people from overseas come in to the gallery sometimes. They're like, oh, that can't possibly be in Australia. You guys don't have snow. And it's like, firstly, you're challenging them that Australia has snow, and then just how much we do and things like that. So I love that aspect of that. But, and that's probably also just then a reflection of, I guess, probably where my kind of passion lies. I love the alpine high country, kind of scenes myself. And so, that probably kind of comes through a little bit in my photos as well. So, yeah.
When you're walking somebody through the gallery and you're showing them the pictures and telling them the stories, what's the most memorable story for you?
It's probably a couple, and they're all quite similar. So a number of years ago, the Canberra Hospital opened a new cancer ward, and it's predominantly, this particular ward was for leukemia. And we did quite a few prints for there. And we have people who might have spent like 3 months in there and basically essentially touch or go. And we've had people come in the gallery who have basically come in to tell me that basically for 3 months they just stared at one of my photos, and that's kind of what literally kind of got them through. And in a couple of cases, they've wanted to come in and then actually buy that same photo and put it up at home as essentially as a kind of reminder of kind of what they went through and how they kind of got through. Equally, we've had just one just recently It was a daughter of a guy that had literally passed away the night before. And so she wanted to come in the gallery and just see, more of what had kind of been there. So, some of that is quite powerful for me about realizing the impact that some of my work can have on people. So I think, that's probably the most impactful things for me is when I people have quite a strong emotional reaction to something. I've had a lady recently that bought a print, and she was in tears because her husband had passed away. Husband of quite a long period had passed away just recently, and I had a shot of a gum tree that just would have meant a lot to him. And, this was a purchase that was basically that, she wanted up, and essentially that was a print of, that represented her husband. So those kind of things are sometimes quite confronting for me, but very, very rewarding about when you realize that, you and I can have a logical argument that says it's just a photo, but you start to realize how much of an impact some of my photos can actually have on people and how meaningful it can be for people. And then I think probably the best thing is when, someone literally kind of tells you that photo essentially got them through 3 months of, kind of chemo treatment or something like that. Like that's awesome. Yeah. And pretty kind of special to know that you've been able to essentially kind of contribute to someone surviving. It's kind of cool. Yeah.
Is that full for you to do more?
So it fuels me to do more, and it fuels me to actually get the photos out in front of more people. So, I guess I probably see, we talk about our purpose for the business is around allowing other people to experience Australia. And, it doesn't, I think, if you look at it from a more altruistic sense in terms of the business, like obviously we're a business and we need to sell, products in order to kind of make money. But I don't get, if people come in the gallery or they go on the website and they can just appreciate what we have and how lucky we are here in Australia with what we have, and they appreciate the Australian landscape, and they don't actually buy, but either by coming into the gallery or, looking on the website or what have you, we've helped shift them or made them appreciate how lucky we are in Australia with what we have, then that's enough too. You know what I mean? So I think for me, the more that I can showcase Australia to more people and raise their kind of level of awareness of what we are lucky to have in this country, but also the kind of fragility of the environment in some cases too, that is a strong motivator for me beyond just simple kind of business metrics. Yeah.
In your quest to get more people to see your work, to experience Australia, you've decided to work with your wife. Tell me about that journey. Tell me about what she brings to the business, what she brings to the partnership of both of you working together.
So it's not the way people would often kind of expect a business built around a photographer to be. And what I mean by that is she was in the business full time before I was. And so people kind of tend to think, because it's my name out the front, if you want to think of it like that, people tend to think that, this is kind of Scott's business because it's built around Scott. But it is a business. It's not just about, Scott being a photographer and gets to travel around and do all this kind of cool stuff. It is like we're running it it is a business that just kind of has my name out the front, but, there's a team that kind of sits behind it. So I guess what she brings to the business, and the reason that, ultimately she was kind of in the business full time before I was, is what it's recognizing that we need a team of people that all bring different kind of skill sets to the business. And so obviously my strength, as I see it, is obviously in terms of capturing the photos and then running the business. What she is terrific at is she's an accountant by background. But I would say that she's not your typical accountant. And what I mean by that is my kind of typical version of accountant is someone that's relatively kind of an introvert, kind of sits at the desk, not too kind of social. She can talk to anyone. She's very social. So she's brilliant from a in a corporate sense, from a business development perspective, she's great at getting the business out there, building relationships with corporate clients, and just terrific with people, and helping solve their problems. She's working with organizations that are like, right, we're building a new aged care facility or what have you, and she's helping them choose the right artworks that are going to make the right impact for what they're trying to achieve and things like that. So she's really, really good at that. And so she's terrific with the corporate clients that we have around the country, to really make sure that we're delivering to them a really, really good outcome in terms of an office fit out, in terms of artworks and things like that. So that's definitely kind of her strength in terms of the ability to kind of just really help people find the right answer for what they're looking for. But obviously then she's got a corporate finance background. So she's worked in for West Farmers, big ASX listed company, through to some smaller firms, and finished up as a CFO of a multinational advertising agency before she kind of came to us. So she's got kind of big corporate experience as well. And so we always talk about the fact that we think big, we're not trying to think like a small business. And so she kind of balances my perhaps kind of military kind of thinking with, some kind of big corporate experience, where we definitely try not to think like a big business. So I think, between the two of us, that kind of balances things out. But equally, I am probably a little bit more kind of creative on some things. And because it's, she jokes that if I had my way, I'd be ordering, heaps of stock to make sure that we had, plenty of stuff. And because she's the accountant, she's like, no, we'd have no, and I joke that we'd have no stock if she had her way. And so we probably kind of land somewhere in the middle, which is probably about the right answer. So I think, but between the two of us, we probably kind of balance each other out in terms of strengths, and then how we kind of arrive at some decisions. But all that said, so it's not easy working with your partner in that sense, and she would probably say the same thing. And so we've definitely had to try and work out where some of those kind of boundaries lie around, what are her areas of responsibility, what is mine. And then also, I think probably the biggest challenge that we have is just that because we're a husband and wife, we never stop talking about the business. So, we might be cleaning our teeth at night before we go to bed, and then we're talking about work, that's kind of not normal, if you know what I mean. So I think, probably one of our biggest challenges is trying to kind of create a bit of separation between what I would call, kind of work life, personal life. But when you're running a business, it's really hard because you are all in, and because it's both of us, and it's, we're both in the business, like we're all in, like it's a small, family owned business effectively. We are all in. And so therefore, it is a big part of our lives in a sense. And so you are talking about it a lot of the time, which, if we both had, if I was just in the business and she had something else, then the level of kind of discussion late at night or early in the morning, wouldn't kind of occur. So I think, that's got its pros and cons. But, we get to, the nature of the business is that I get to travel a lot. She obviously comes with me, as do the kids and things, like on some trips. And then sometimes I'm off, traveling on my own and things like that. So, it's not all bad in the sense that it does have its challenges, yet some of the opportunities that it presents are amazing as well. So, it again, balance. But we've certainly had to, over time, try and navigate some of those challenges. And I'll be honest, like it's not always easy. So some people just couldn't, we talked to some couples that are like, there is no way we could work together, and other couples are like, yeah, like we make it work. And I don't think that we necessarily, it's probably not how we didn't, when we got married, it wasn't like we envisaged that, we were going to kind of go into business together as such, but it's just how it's transpired. And I'm not saying we'll always, that she'll always be in the business, that it'll always be the way it is at the moment, but we've made it work. But I'd be lying if I said it wasn't easy either,
Maybe it's the circles I hang out in, but I've seen more and more husbands and wives working together, having to balance children and pressures of work and all of those things. For all of us to learn from somebody who has strong systems, what are your systems like to ensure that love and care that both of you had for each other at the start still stays fresh?
I think, and I find this easier than Philippa does, and maybe it is that kind of military background a little bit, is I find it easier to yeah, my experience in the military is, I had this a number of times from what from some great leaders where, someone might have stuffed up, and it's like you're hauled into the office, and I'm literally giving you a kind of dressing down, and you're in the shit, and you've done something bad, and you're kind of copying it from me as an example. At the end of that meeting, it's like, right, are we going to the pub? That ability to kind of separate that we've just had, a relatively kind of formal kind of discussion about an underperformance or an issue on something, but that doesn't define the relationship, if you understand what I mean. So I find that notion easy, probably because of that kind of military background to some extent, that I can have, if I have a disagreement with Philippa around something and in a business discussion, once we've finished that conversation, I'm kind of done. Like it's separate. I think for her, she struggled, and I'm having that conversation as two kind of business partners, not as husband and wife. I think for her, she struggles more with trying to separate what is essentially the fact that we're a husband and wife having that kind of discussion. So if there was advice where you can, I think it's about having kind of being quite clear that when you're having a husband-wife conversation versus when you're having a business partner kind of conversation, because you don't want to, I think, in a contestability point of view in business, I think it's important that it's okay to have opposing views. It's okay to not agree with one another. You don't have to agree with one another. And I'm quite comfortable with that. I think Philippa probably struggles with that a little bit more. So the advice that I would give, I think, is to where you can I think she's got a lot better at, separate at understanding that that's my view, and so therefore don't take something personally if we're disagreeing. It's easier said than done though. And so I guess my advice would be, for other couples, is around trying to, where you can, as best you can, to try and create a kind of clear understanding between the two of you around what is essentially a business partner when you're having a business partner discussion, and that doesn't necessarily reflect on your personal relationship. Now, that's all well and good and easy for me to kind of say, a lot harder to kind of actually execute on. But I think that's the key, but that's easier said than done.
As you're building this business together, if we can distill it down to, what are 3 values you want your children to be able to see?
I think so. Definitely one is around, I don't want to say hard. I kind of want to say hard work, but I don't think that's the right way to say it. But because I think if I say hard work, that can kind of be misconstrued to an extent that just if you just work hard, you will kind of achieve success. Because you still got to be working hard in the right way, with the right approach or what have you. But that said, and that's why I guess I'm just kind of trying to qualify this a little bit, I do think that, definitely something that I want to instill in our kids is that, that hard work does, you do get rewarded for hard work. And that hard work is kind of critical to success. Like nothing worth kind of, achieving in life comes easy, and that, you do have to work hard at things. You do have to be persistent. Goes back to some of what we were talking about earlier about kind of persistence, about some of that kind of grit and determination, that hopefully that they can see that if there's something that they really want to achieve in life, whether it be, from a school perspective around getting good grades in year 12 or what it is that they want to go and do, beyond school or whatever the case may be, that they have to kind of work hard towards that it just doesn't land on your plate. You have to kind of work towards it. But I guess the caveat around that is also, but trying to make sure that they're aware that that hard work in of itself isn't enough, that you have to be smart about how you kind of work, that you have to have a bit of a plan, things like that. So in terms of values, definitely, kind of hard work and determination, is probably one of them. But, the other one is around probably about being smart about how you do operate, and that you should be trying to going back to my kind of 1% better kind of continuous improvement, continuous learning view, is that, how do I be better? Like hard work itself. So you need hard work, but that alone isn't enough. That how do I learn? And that might be self-learning. How do I, read a bunch of books? Where is this information? Can I draw on the lessons and learnings of other people? So I guess the next value is probably around that kind of, having that kind of what we would talk about in today's kind of vernacular around lifelong learning, just that you need to kind of constantly be kind of trying to learn. They're probably the two. You asked for three, but they're probably the two, from a business point of view that probably jump out at me. Have to probably think a bit more about the third one.
Scott, you've spent years in the career, in the passion that you liked in service of Australia. Then you decided to transition into, let's call it civilian life. What does that transition look like?
I think it looks different for everyone. And my experience is unique, and as is everyone's. But I think there are some probably core elements that are quite similar for a lot of people. So for me, the transition was quite abrupt. And so what I mean by that is a lot of people, when they get out of the military, they get out of the military, but maybe they transition into something that is similar or working with similar people to what they were doing before. So a lot of people take the transition for them is a transition, i.e. it's not abrupt. And so it's a transition from being in the military to maybe they're kind of almost, in some people's cases, they kind of get out and they're now almost doing something very similar to what they were doing when they're in the military, maybe even contracting back to the military or something like that, but now they're no longer in uniform. So that's what I would call like a kind of more of a soft transition where they're kind of stepping out of the military in the day-to-day sense, but they haven't stepped away too far from the people that they're used to working with. Maybe they haven't moved geographically from where they were previously, and they're working in a similar field or doing a similar job to what they were doing. So that's kind of the softer type of transition, and then I guess it gets increasingly kind of harder or more abrupt if you want, the further that you move away from the military. So I think a lot of people, my experience from just looking at my kind of cohort of people that I, joined the military with and so forth, and most people that I see, they do that kind of softer style transition where they get out, but they're still either working back to something that's in the military, working in defense industry, or surrounded by a bunch of people that are kind of ex-military or what have you. I felt like I did something that was a little bit more abrupt, if you want to call it that, where I was doing something that, in terms of joining the public service and working with a bunch of people that weren't ex-military, wasn't necessarily specifically, he was still working in government, but wasn't, necessarily kind of as closely kind of tied to defense. And so I felt like, I probably cut that umbilical cord, quite quickly in that sense. But, I was still in Canberra and I was still kind of, in that government environment, whereas some people then make a much harder transition again, where they abruptly go and, pick up a job overseas doing something kind of completely unrelated. But, if I was to characterize most people, they do something that is still in somehow connected, for a lot of maybe, Army infantry types, they might go and get a security job or something where they still feel like they're kind of doing something similar to what they were doing. I think that it's kind of natural that people kind of fall to something that they're kind of closer to, and that's not a criticism of anyone's transition as such. It's just a broad reflection of how I see a lot of it kind of happening, that people don't necessarily jump too far away. I think the further you jump, though, the harder it kind of can be. And so I think that's when, we talk about people that kind of struggle with a transition or that have more difficulty. I think especially if you've been in the military for quite a period of time, you're used to always being around people that that you're working with people that have been through the same experiences, same kind of training. You're all talking a common language. You don't have to sit there and explain things. If I say I've done XYZ course, someone automatically and knows exactly what that means. They know what, by extension, a bunch of things that flow from that. Whereas if I say that to somebody else, I've now got to spend half an hour kind of explaining what that is, and there's a whole bunch of assumptions you just don't have to go through. So I think the further you move away from that, the further you're moving away from a support network, the further you're moving away from that kind of network of people that already know that stuff. So I think the more of that hard jump you make, the harder it can kind of be for you, because you are stepping now into a very foreign, work environment, culture, and with no kind of support network kind of around you. And so I think the further you kind of move, so that softer transition is probably easier, but it's less of it, and therefore it's a less of a transition.
I'll tell you why I asked the question. I grew up in Sri Lanka. There was a civil war for 30 years. My friends who, joined active service, who, not part of it, after that, when we speak, they speak about, hey, look, I'm doing something really meaningful. I'm really enjoying life after the military. I'm surrounded by lots of people, but I feel lonely. And when I unpack that, or when I chat with the people that are closest to me, it's what you touched on. To say, yeah, there are people around me, but I don't know if that camaraderie exists. I don't know if that common, even simple things like the common language set exist. And growing up in Sri Lanka, there's not a lot of support there for, somebody who wants to at least have a conversation about things like that. Now, it gets a little more trickier for somebody who's been in active combat for a decade and then has to transition into civilian life, because your mindset, I hear, is very different. What type of supports are available for somebody that's transitioning from active service to civilian life?
I think it's certainly changed, certainly from when I did it, because I got out, a fair while ago now. So at the time, there was you did what they called a transition seminar or kind of thing, which was basically, you went to a conference for a couple of days, and you'd have someone from MSBS, or what is now your Commonwealth kind of super corporation, kind of turn up and tell you what arrangements happened with your super, and then someone would tell you about, well, this is now you're going to have to go and get a Medicare card because you have free everything's kind of provided for. This is how kind of Medicare works, and then this is how a bunch of things work. That so it was very what I would call largely kind of administrative, and then there was a session on, well, this is how you write a CV, and this is what and things like that. So whereas, as I understand it, a lot of the transition seminar stuff now is a lot more about some of the other kind of support network stuff that's available, whether it be from Veterans Affairs through to other ex-service organisations and things like that. So my understanding is that whole kind of transition experience these days is a lot more kind of supported than it probably was. Certainly when I did it, but equally by some accounts, there's probably still some room for improvement there. But I think by and large, the support networks that DVA and others kind of have in place, as I understand it these days, is probably better than it was back then. But you still sometimes you don't know what you don't know either, and so I think even my own experience, DVA is probably only even recently that I've learned that DVA offered some services that probably would have been handy for me to know that existed, previously and things like that. So, I think there's, like a lot of things in life, there's a lot of things that are out there, but if you don't know they're out there, you don't know that you can kind of access them or not. But it's certainly probably changed a little bit from when I did it, probably for the better.
And what's the role family has played, Scott, in helping you understand yourself better as you live in civilian society, as you start a business, as you mature?
Look, I think family plays an important role no matter kind of where you are on your journey. I think a lot of people probably outside the military don't understand what a lot of what I would say military families go through. And what I mean by that is, when you're in the military, you're often posted quite regularly. Friends of mine who are up to, 25th posting or whatever the case may be, you're never in a place very long. And the family, the partner or the family kind of more broadly is making a lot of sacrifices in order to support the activity of who it is who's in the military, or sometimes might be husband and wife because maybe they both met when they're in the military or whatever the case may be. So I think from a transition perspective, you talk about what's the kind of role of the family. I also think that what we kind of miss in some of the narrative is the sacrifice or that the family has made in order to support the person that's been in the military, extended deployments at a time, a lot of moves, mum or dad, whoever the member is, being away a lot. So I think also for them, there's a transition for them from having, mum or dad or whatever the case may be, deployed for extended periods of time, especially, more recently in terms of global war on terror and things like that, where people were deployed a lot and for extended periods. There's a period of transition, I think, for the family as well. So obviously, I think people think about, what's the family got to do to kind of support the transition of the member, but it's also, that the kids and the partner that are involved in them probably returning to a bit more of normality or a little bit more kind of less tension as well. Dad's away, is he going to come back, and some of the uncertainty that exists there, or just the lack of comms, mum being left or, dad being left, depending upon, who it is, being left to kind of run the house. And they've kind of got their own kind of systems and structures in place. And then suddenly kind of dad or mum comes back and then they want things run differently and say, well, hang on, everything's been running fine while you've been away. So, I think it's very easy for us to just focus on the member who is transitioning, whereas I would argue that, and I think there's greater recognition, certainly in military circles now than there has been, but, to a broader society perspective is recognition that, the families are transitioning too, and that there's, support that they probably need, including while, people are still in. So I think, that's probably a forgotten or sometimes overlooked aspect that families have had to give up. Often the partner has had to forgo or sacrifice their own career in order for the member to kind of pursue theirs. And then sometimes it's like, okay, the member might be getting out of the military and like, okay, well, now it's my partner's time to kind of pursue what they want to pursue. So how do we make sure that, we support that family to now, let the other partner kind of go and pursue their career or what they want to do, or how does that work? So there can be quite a bit of kind of change and not turmoil, but quite a bit of kind of change and pressure on families too when someone kind of transitions. And then, equally, if, that the member is transitioning and doing what I would call more of a hard transition where, they're going through quite a challenging time to try and adjust to a new and different environment. And the family is too, because what they're used to in terms of what mum or dad normally kind of goes and does is quite different. And so, my point is that we need to kind of consider the transition the family is kind of going through as well. Yeah.
Looking ahead over a decade from now, if your girls want to have a conversation with you about service, joining the military, how would you approach that conversation?
Look, I would be encouraging of it. I think a big thing that's been instilled in me is, we talk about this phrase about, service before self. I think, serving in the military or, even, whether that be emergency services either, whether it be police, fireys, and so forth. And I think they don't often get enough attention on these kind of subject matters. But, it's about service before self. It is about putting others ahead of you, and that you're serving the country, but you are serving others. You are making sacrifices in your own personal life, in a sense, for the betterment, for the greater good. That's not to say that you can't have a highly fulfilling, rewarding kind of career and have a great time in doing it. But I think it is important for people that are considering joining is recognizing that you are making certain sacrifices, but you are making it for the greater good, and that you need to be kind of comfortable with that too, because not everyone is kind of comfortable with that. Not everyone is comfortable with the fact that they are going to have to endure some hardships, because that's often the nature of kind of military service in some settings, or potentially, worst case, ultimately, sacrifice their life for the greater good. And so I think, if there was encouragement there, it's about making sure that people are going in kind of eyes wide open around that. This is, I see it as, as a very honourable, pathway to choose. For that reason, that you are putting other people ahead of yourself, but to also be aware that is what you're doing, that you need to kind of be comfortable with that, not to go in with an illusion that it is just kind of some fancy kind of Hollywood movie, and that, that's the only kind of aspect of it. But, look, I would, to anyone listening or people that are thinking about, if they're early kind of in their career and are thinking about joining the military, then I had a fantastic time. I've got lots of friends who are still in. I've got lots of friends who are out, but who are, maybe still doing reserve work or what have you. Like, I think it's a fantastic, kind of career choice for multiple reasons, because again, high level, you are kind of, you're putting, you are serving with purpose. You are putting something kind of greater than yourself around that. But equally, some of the opportunities that are presented to you and what you get to do through a life in the military is things you would just never dream of being able to do or experience or do things in just about any other kind of occupation. And so, it's awesome from that point of view. So I would encourage anyone that is, remotely interested to try and either, talk to Defence Force Recruiting or talk to someone that they know or a family member, or somehow talk to people that have served in the military so they can kind of get an idea of what is before them. But I would encourage anyone to contemplate it. And there's just so many options. It doesn't matter what your particular kind of interest is in terms of a field. There's probably a role for you somewhere across the ADF. And, equally, I think, we're living in, we are going to see probably in our lifetime, a need for, the ADF is going to be called upon in probably a way that we probably have not seen the ADF called upon, certainly in our lifetimes, to defend Australia and our national interests in a very geostrategic, uncertain environment with a very kind of rapidly changing global order where we are challenged by authoritarian regimes wanting to impose a certain set of kind of standards and values that are diametrically opposed to those that we're kind of familiar with and that we believe are right. And that can not end well. And so I think, people that are willing to kind of stand up and ultimately fight for what is, I believe is right, and for a set of values that we believe are worth protecting, I don't think there's too much more honourable a kind of cause or calling or, vocation that you can do than that. So that's my very heavy kind of way to finish on that. Yeah.
Scott, if someone wants to connect with you to, have a conversation, invite you for a corporate conversation, or just connect with your beautiful artwork, where do people find you?
Yeah, so first up, obviously, if they're in Canberra, they can find the gallery. So we're in Kingston, so just in 33 Jardine Street in Kingston, so just across the road from Green Square, for those that know Kingston. Obviously, from anyone from anywhere else, they can find us online, so just literally scottleggo.com. All the collection is there. You can order online and we ship all over the world. And then obviously on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, just under Scott Leggo. So if you search for Scott Leggo, you'll find us. So pretty easy to find whether you're in Canberra or anywhere in the world from that point of view.
Scott, thank you for your service. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing those insights about business, parenting, military, and being a wonderful husband. Thank you so much. I've learned so much from you in these couple of hours, and I'm sure the audience can get some really good value also. So thank you for your time.
That's right. You're welcome. And hopefully, for your audience, there's something, in there for everyone, and there's some key takeaways for them. And thanks for your time and trying to, share other people's stories, not just your own, with a broader audience. So, so congratulations on what you're trying to do with this podcast. So thank you.
Thank you. A massive thank you to Crown Plaza Canberra for hosting this episode of the podcast. If you are looking for really nice accommodation in close proximity to Canberra CBD, or if you want well-appointed meeting spaces, check out Crown Plaza Canberra. Thank you again.